Leaving the path I had been on did not look like a breakdown. It looked like a clean decision. From the outside, it could be framed as self-development, a brave pivot, a man choosing meaning over money. But inside, it felt like a rupture, like stepping out of a city at night and realizing you can't go back because the streets no longer lead anywhere you can respect. The structure I had lived inside, deadlines, hierarchy, measurability, outcomes, had been carrying more of my identity than I realized. When the structure disappeared, the ground didn't become freedom. It became space, and space can be destabilizing if you don't know how to inhabit it. There was relief, yes, but also the quiet awareness that something holding me upright had just been removed. This is where modern healing often misleads. It offers a linear map. Identify the problem, make the change, feel better, move on, move forward. Initiation does not work like that. The Buddhist story of Siddhartha captures it beautifully. The prince leaves the palace not because he is rebellious, but because he finally sees sickness, aging, and death. The palace wasn't evil, it was incomplete. When he walks out, the world doesn't become clearer. It becomes real. Leaving finance did the same thing to me. It didn't solve my questions. It made them louder. Structure had hidden those questions before. Without it, they arrived fully raw and exposed. This is where the false map becomes dangerous. If you expect every step away from the old life to feel like improvement, you will misread the terrain when the ground turns unstable. Leaving one structure means you must build another, or you will float. Sleep becomes the first casualty. When a man believes freedom means no rhythm, the body is neglected. When he believes insight places him beyond biology, consequence gets minimized when impulses start being called truth. Community is replaced by isolation because nobody understands him. Discipline becomes optional because he is finding himself. That isn't awakening, that is drift. And drift is how most men end up lost while believing they are actually evolving. Leaving the palace is just the beginning, not the victory. The victory is learning to hold the questions without letting them consume your life. The thread still applies here more than ever. Protect, sleep, train the body, stay accountable, respect the real world. And remember that meaning never cancels consequence. Meditation became my new structure, but it wasn't the gentle wellness trend people imagine. I sat down thinking I was choosing calm. What I actually chose was exposure. Watch the breath long enough and you start seeing what the breath has been holding, what it has kept down. Thoughts arrive like weather. Moods change without permission. Old memories rise from nowhere. Sometimes the mind moves faster when you sit still, not slower. The strangest part is how quickly the mind tries to narrate everything, turning raw experience into a story about progress. There is a reason the hermit appears across spiritual traditions. The old monastic image is not simply peace. It is withdrawal for the sake of seeing clearly. A man leaves the noise of the village, not because he is above others, but because he needs silence strong enough to expose what he really is. That was the myth mirror here. I was moving inward, away from distraction, into a kind of chosen solitude that could reveal truth or magnify my distortion, depending on whether I stayed tethered or not. Modern healing often reinforces the wrong side of this movement. Track your growth, label your stages, measure improvement, but the real experience is not linear. The same themes turn at deeper levels. The same fears appear wearing different masks. Stoic philosophy helps here because it strips away the romance. The Stoics weren't chasing spiritual fireworks. They were interested in what you can govern: your judgments, your actions, your discipline. Meditation taught the same lesson in a different language. I could watch thoughts, but I couldn't force them to stop. I could see emotions, but I couldn't command them to disappear. What I could develop was steadiness, steadfastness, how I respond, how I choose, how I return to the thread. When the inner weather grows loud, psychologically, that is the real function of solitude, not self-importance, exposure. The hermit goes inward to see what is actually there. But meditation can also become escape. A man can sit for hours and call it healing while his sleep collapses, whilst his body weakens, whilst his responsibilities rot, and whilst his relationships fade. That is not depth. That is classic avoidance, the kind of avoidance which wears sacred clothing. The discipline, therefore, has to be concrete. Same wake time, physical training, food that keeps the nervous system stable, community contact that pulled me back to reality, and respect for consequence. Because no insight gained in meditation would protect me if I started behaving as though I were beyond limits. The spiral is not a staircase to permanent peace. It is a training ground for steadiness. Then came the hunger to understand. I read Philosophy the Way a Starving Man Eats. Fast, wide, convinced the next page might contain the missing key. Existentialism, mysticism, psychology, comparative religion. I wanted a map that could explain the architecture of experience I was touching in meditation. The more I read, the more patterns appeared. Traditions, separated by centuries, were describing similar terrain in different languages. But there is a trap here, and it is very subtle. The mind begins to believe that understanding is the same as integration. That if you can name something, you have mastered it. Sufi mysticism speaks directly to this through fana and baka, dissolution and return. The ego dissolves, yes, but then you return. You come back into the world, into responsibility, into embodied life. If you don't return, if you stay dissolved, you have not transcended. You have simply disappeared. Reading gave me patterns, but it also seduced me into living inside pattern recognition. Every concept felt like a rung on a ladder, but initiation isn't a ladder, it is a fire. It does not ask what you know, it asks what you can hold. Can you hold uncertainty without numbing yourself? Can you hold insight without superiority? Can you hold pain without making it everyone else's burden? This is where the thread becomes non-negotiable. I had to keep my body in the conversation. I had to move and sweat and breathe and sleep. I had to keep law and consequence in the conversation, because no philosophy would protect me if I started acting out. I had to keep community in the conversation, because isolation can make any story sound convincing. And I had to keep discipline in the conversation, because without discipline, the mind confuses intensity for truth. The Sufis understood something simple. The point is not to dissolve and stay dissolved. The point is to dissolve what is false and return with what is real. The most dangerous shift did not arrive as a crisis. It formed quietly as a narrative inside of me. I began to believe I had seen something early, that meditation had revealed a layer of reality most people ignored, that philosophy had pulled back a curtain. I never announced it. It simply shaped the way I moved through rooms. This is exactly why it is dangerous, because it feels like maturity, while it is actually the first stage of inflation. This is where the myth of Icarus becomes precise psychological instruction. He mistakes ascent for invulnerability. He experiences height and interprets it as exemption. This is how certainty behaves when it turns mythic inside a man. He feels lifted and begins believing ordinary limits no longer apply to him. Gnostic traditions sometimes describe the world as a false enclosure, ignorance as prison, awakening as secret knowledge. There is truth in the symbolism, but also grave risk. If you begin to see yourself as one of the knowers, humility quietly evaporates. Other people become asleep while you imagine yourself awake. And the moment that happens, you stop listening. You stop being correctable. You stop being held. If you cannot be held, you are not an initiate. You are a risk. Inflation always carries that Icarus quality. The wax melts while the height itself feels like proof. Overreach becomes discernment. Distance becomes clarity. Superiority becomes insight. That is where the thread reveals its real purpose. It is not just self-care. It is reality testing. Sleep reduces the mind's suggestibility to its own fantasies. A trained body provides regulation so agitation is not mistaken for revelation. Law and consequence remind you that the world does not bend to your interpretations. Community and accountability puncture the bubble when you start floating away. Discipline prevents insight from turning into enlightenment. Modern healing often says, trust your truth, but a man in inflation already trusts his truth. The real question is different. Can you submit your truth to structure? Can you let somebody say, that is not real, and consider it? Because the moment you cannot do that, the descent has already begun. Eventually, certainty itself became a drug, not substances, certainty. The feeling of having a clean interpretation of life, the sense of being right about the deeper pattern of things. Every new insight produced a small rush, and the mind began chasing that rush the way it chases anything that relieves tension. This is the stage of the false summit. You believe you have arrived, and that belief becomes the platform from which you fall. Jungian psychology describes one version of this through the puer aeternus, the eternal youth who wants altitude without weight, revelation without duty, freedom without consequence. He loves possibility, purity, and intensity, but resists the ordinary structures that make depth livable. This archetype does not always appear immature. Sometimes it looks incredibly gifted, sensitive, ahead of the curve, but underneath lies the same refusal to come fully down to earth. modern therapeutic culture can accidentally reinforce it by turning reality into identity. The healed one, the awakened one, the conscious one. Initiation begins before catastrophe, precisely because it begins at the level of identity. When the identity becomes I understand, life eventually introduces something you cannot understand. And when the corridors darken, which is not a punishment, it is the psyche demanding humility. Because if it is going to become whole, it requires humility. The warning signs were simple, which is why they are easy to miss. Sleep slipping because I wanted more time in my head. Responsibilities feeling like distractions. Relationships becoming optional because nobody gets it. The body becoming secondary because consciousness seemed to matter more. That is drift, and drift is how a man walks into danger while believing he is advancing spiritually. The poor mistake is confusing lightness with freedom. But any insight that cannot survive routine, responsibility, and correction is still unstable. The correction, therefore, has to be practical. Restore rhythm, protect sleep, train the body, keep commitments, let community hold you, respect consequence. The purpose of this work is not to feel profound. It is to become stable enough to carry depth without being destroyed by it. The false map says, if it feels meaningful, it must be true. The real map says, if it is true, it will survive structure. And structure always begins with the thread.